Welcome. This module will highlight key areas of the R2v3 Code of Practices. While the intention of this training module is to increase understanding, it is not intended to be used as a standalone guide. To download the complete Code of Practices, please visit the document library on the SERI website. The Code of Practices is the guiding document for the R2 certification program. The Code of Practices has been developed to ensure that certification bodies and accreditation bodies follow the same set of guidelines to implement the R2 certification program. This training module highlights key areas of the R2v3 Code of Practices that are of particular importance to R2 auditors. Most R2 certifications are for a facility with one location owned by a single entity. Some organizations, however, do not fit this description. The R2 Code of Practices provides some alternative certification structures to accommodate different ownership and organizational structures. Campus facilities is for an organization owned by a single entity that has multiple locations that work together with coordinated operations under a central management system. One location will be the primary controlling location, with all the other locations fulfilling unique operations to meet the single scope. Operations are interconnected and jointly process common equipment. Each location of the campus is audited together on every audit. Under the new Code of Practices, multi-sites are no longer identified under the certification structures. Shared facilities applies to different companies operating recycling operations independently within the same location. Each company will be independently audited and certified. Common parent facilities applies to multiple legal entities, each wholly owned by the same parent company. All the legal entities operate under the same management system, and therefore one audit covers all activities and scope of operations. The CB will issue one certificate that lists each of the legal entities. Multiple certificates will not be issued. Group is specific to multiple companies, owned by different entities operating together to fulfill the activities of one single scope. The organizations can be at one location or multiple locations. In this structure, all companies must operate under the same management system. All locations will be audited during each audit cycle. The CB will issue one group certificate that lists each of the certified entities. Multiple certificates will not be issued. During the contract review phase, the certification body will work with the facility to determine which structure best fits the organization. As an auditor, it's important to confirm the validity of the structure while on site, as the certification structure will be identified on the R2 certificate. The scope statement specifies the R2 process requirements and material types that are to be audited and certified at the location listed on the R2 certificate. The purpose of the scope statement is to provide transparency about the capabilities of each R2 certified facility. Activities included in the scope must be demonstrated with audit evidence for each of the associated processes and materials. Keep in mind, activities that have not yet been implemented by a facility cannot be audited and certified. Any R2-related activities that are controlled or carried out by a facility or that are being conducted by a downstream vendor cannot be excluded from the audit. For each process or activity listed in the scope, the facility must have records and other required audit evidence that will demonstrate each process performed by the facility is done so in accordance with R2 requirements. As an auditor, verification of the scope begins during the preparation phases and audit planning. It's critical to notify the CB as soon as possible of any discrepancies identified in the scope or assigned appendices. Every R2 process appendix has been allocated specific audit time. A misidentified appendix will most likely require additional audit time. The Code of Practices requires that specific terminology be used when defining a facility's scope statement. The required words are based on the specific process requirements or appendices that apply to the R2 facility's operation. This is intended to provide more consistent and transparent descriptions about the capabilities of each facility. The appendices each have a designated word or phrase to describe a specific R2 process or activity. These terms should only be included in the scope if the R2 facility performs the associated processes. No additional words can be used to supplement these processes. If the R2 facility qualifies to be certified under data sanitization in Appendix B, it must be specified as to whether the certification covers logical sanitization, physical sanitization, or both. Any reference to sanitization in the scope only applies to processes or activities certified to R2 process requirement, Appendix B, data sanitization. Data destruction activities covered under Core Requirement 7 are not to be listed on the R2 certificate. In addition, if the R2 facility qualifies to be certified under test and repair in Appendix C, it shall be specified as to whether the certification covers test, repair, or both. In addition to the processes and activities being performed, the scope statement must include the specific types of equipment, components, and materials that are controlled by the R2 facility. Let's look at a few examples of scope statements. The first example is collection, logical data sanitization, test and repair of used cell phones. Collection indicates that the R2 facility has Appendix A and ships cell phones or components to downstream vendors. Logical data sanitization indicates that the R2 facility performs logical data sanitization in accordance with the requirements in Appendix B, data sanitization. Test and repair indicates that the R2 facility tests and repairs used cell phones in accordance with the requirements in Appendix C, test and repair. It's important that only activities performed by the R2 facility are listed in the scope. Remember, activities carried out by downstream vendors should not be included. In this example, the scope statement is materials recovery of lithium-ion batteries from used electronic equipment and components. In this case, the scope indicates that the R2 facility is the final processor of lithium-ion batteries into its raw material components and operates in accordance to the Appendix E materials recovery requirements. It's important to note that there would be no downstream vendors at this R2 facility. Evidence would have to demonstrate that no focus materials were being shipped to downstream vendors. The outputs at this facility would be raw material streams of non-focus materials. The scope statement for this example is materials recovery and physical data destruction of used electronic equipment, logical sanitization, test and repair of cell phones. In this scenario, materials recovery without collection indicates that the facility has been certified to Appendix E, materials recovery, and is the final disposition for the used electronic equipment. Materials recovery can include a variety of activities, such as destructive dismantling, possibly shredding, or other materials recovery operations. Physical data destruction under Appendix B would be for all used electronic equipment. It's important to know that once an R2 facility has certified to Appendix B, all equipment that undergoes physical or logical sanitization must be carried out following the requirements established in Appendix B. For cell phones only, this scope statement indicates that the R2 facility performs physical and logical sanitization of cell phones under Appendix B and test and repair operations under Appendix C. For more information on this topic, refer to the Scope section in the R2 v3 Code of Practices. If an R2 facility processes only mobile equipment, generic wording such as used electronics is not permitted. Using all-encompassing wording such as consumer electronics or used electronics can only be used if the R2 facility is qualified to sort and process numerous types of electronics. Specialty electronic equipment shall also be accurately and specifically defined to indicate the types of specialty electronics managed. Unrestricted streams, for example, white goods, new equipment, and vehicles, are not permitted in the scope. Planned future additions of equipment, components, and materials associated with scope that are not currently operational are not eligible for certification. Sometimes changes will occur at a facility that require a change in the facility's scope of certification. For example, changes in processes or activities undertaken at a facility, or changes in the electronic equipment, components, or materials managed, operational expansions, mergers, or any other change in an R2 facility's operation. Remember, as an auditor, if you identify changes in the scope, it's critical to stop the audit and contact your CB for further direction. A review of the R2 facility's CB contract will take place to ensure additional time does not need to be assigned. The amount of time required to conduct an R2 audit directly correlates to the facility's scope, the number of facility employees, and the additional process requirements or appendices that are being certified at the facility. Calculating audit time begins with Table 4 in the Code of Practices, which specifies the amount of audit time to be allocated to core requirements. Audit time assigned to the core can only be used to audit the core R2 requirements. It's important to clearly identify R2 audit time separately in the audit plan. In addition, if a campus is being audited, that time would have to be clearly assigned to the campus location. Additional audit time is assigned for each process requirement that is being audited. These calculations are found in Tables 5A, B, and C of the Code of Practices. Audit time assigned to appendices can only be used to audit the R2 process requirements. It's important to clearly identify R2 audit time separately in the audit plan. In addition, if a campus is being audited, that time would have to be clearly assigned to the campus location. A campus location with a specific appendix will have full audit time based on the Tables 5A, B, and C. An audit plan must be created for all R2 audits. The audit plan must include all names, locations, each specific address, and scopes that are being audited for each location, and shall also indicate the time allocated for auditing each core requirement and applicable R2 process requirements at each location. An audit day is 8 hours. An auditor can conduct a maximum of 10 hours in an audit day. R2 audit time can be used to audit R2 requirements only. In the following slide, we will explain what requirements must be audited separately and those that can be audited using an integrated approach. The majority of R2 audits will be combined with EH&S and QMS audits. It's important to understand the approach required in the Code of Practices for integrated audits. These sections of the R2 standard must be audited independently of other integrated standards. Core 1, Scope, Core 2, Hierarchy of Responsible Management Strategies, Core 5, Tracking Throughput, Core 6, Sorting, Categorization, and Processing, Core 7, Data Security, Core 8, Focus Materials, Core 9, Facility Requirements, Core 10, Transport, Appendix A, Downstream Recycling Chain, Appendix B, Data Sanitization, Appendix D, Specialty Electronics Reuse. Sections of the R2 standard that may be integrated with the audit of other approved QEH-SMS standards include Core 3, EH&S Management System, Core 4, Legal and Other Requirements, Appendix C, Test and Repair, Appendix E, Materials Recovery, and Appendix F, Brokering. During certification and recertification audits, the auditor is required to ensure all activities are operational and review associated audit evidence. Additionally, a complete cycle of internal audits and compliance audits must also be reviewed. Any nonconformities from the internal audit that are still open at the time of the certification or recertification audit will be written as a nonconformity. It's important that R2 facilities conduct their internal audits in a timely manner, with enough time to close NCs before the certification body audit. During the surveillance audits, there'll be more flexibility to choose what core requirements will be audited. However, the following core requirements must be audited during every annual surveillance audit. Core Requirement 1, Scope, Core Requirement 5, Tracking Throughput, Core Requirement 7, Data Security, and Core Requirement 8, Focus Materials. All applicable process requirements or appendices must be audited during every audit of the certification cycle. During the 3-year certification cycle, one surveillance audit may be conducted remotely. The decision to conduct a remote audit is at the sole discretion of the certification body. To be eligible, the facility must meet certain criteria as required in the Code of Practices, such as appropriate technologies and electronically accessible documents. It's essential that the auditor has access to documents and records that pertain to the R2 requirements. This is especially important in the case of remote audits, where many documents are required to be uploaded prior to the audit. Auditors will be required to take copies of certain documents and records so that they can be included as audit evidence in the audit report. These documents are listed in Table 7 of the Code of Practices. It's important to remember that an audit report is the certification body's evidence that a thorough audit process has been implemented. There are some specific requirements in the Code of Practices related to the audit report that are important to keep in mind. It's not acceptable to copy statements from the R2 facility's written procedures as evidence of implementation and performance. Evidence consists of specific records and performance measurables that demonstrate implementation of the R2 requirements and the R2 facility's written procedures and policies. Specific audit reporting guidance and requirements are outlined in Table 6 of the Code of Practices. Auditors will be required to take copies of certain documents and records that are to be included as part of audit evidence in the audit report. Table 7 of the Code of Practices specifies key documents that the auditor must include with their audit report, including the Focus Materials Management Plan and the Closure Plan. The Code of Practices also includes corrective action requirements. An auditor's job is to assess a facility's conformance to the R2 standard. In areas where the facility is unable to demonstrate evidence of meeting an R2 requirement, record a nonconformity in the audit report. Nonconformities are an excellent tool for identifying areas that require improvement, with the end goal that the facility implements best management practices for its recycling operations and conforms to R2 requirements. Nonconformances are recorded at every audit, including Stage 1. There are two levels of nonconformities, major and minor. Generally, the designation of a minor versus a major is based on the seriousness of the issue and the nature of missing evidence. The Code of Practices requires that certain deficiencies be considered as major nonconformities. A group of related or repetitive nonconformances have been identified, indicating an inadequate or complete absence of implementation of an R2 requirement. NC, where the corrective action has been not effectively maintained from the previous audit. Failure to identify a focus material stream in the FM management plan. Failure to identify a downstream vendor in downstream recycling chain flowchart. Due diligence not performed effectively for shipments of controlled streams. Failure to maintain a valid SERI licensing agreement, or misrepresentation of any aspect of the certification scope, including the existence or status of any facility or seller, name, or location affiliated with the company. The certification body will assign additional follow-up audit time for each nonconformity. This allows time for the auditor to verify corrective actions have been taken and close the nonconformity. Timeframes for closing NCs are defined in the Code of Practices. Keep in mind, the CB may have more stringent requirements for closure timeframes of NCs. The CB is required to define the time necessary to review NCs and their associated actions to ensure closure. NCs must be closed prior to issuance of an R2 certificate. Stage 1 NCs only require correction to be submitted prior to the Stage 2 audit. The CB may determine whether additional time is required to review corrections. For more information on this topic, see the section entitled Classification and Closure of NCs in the Code of Practices. The CB may conduct additional special audits at their discretion. Special audits to be conducted for reasons such as verifying changes in the R2 facility's operations and scope, investigating complaints or allegations, closure of NCs, or resolution of suspension issues. The Code of Practices specifies the process that CBs must follow to verify and audit the move of an R2 facility from one location to another. The CB auditor is required to audit the new location prior to the completion of the move. The CB will suspend the certificate from the previous R2 facility location if the new facility location cannot be audited prior to completing the move of its certified scope of operations. The new location must be operational and have completed its internal R2 audit, compliance audit, and any other applicable internal audits. If the audit and issuance of the certificate for the new facility is not completed within 6 months of the move, the CB will withdraw the R2 certificate for the previous location. This means the facility would need a new Stage 1 and Stage 2 audit of the new facility location if it decides to reapply for certification. If an R2 facility chooses to change its certification body, good communication is crucial to avoid a possible lapse in certification. To ensure a smooth and timely transfer, the facility should inform SERI and the former CB of the intended change. SERI monitors and works to improve the R2 certification program through activities such as audit package reviews that evaluate the quality of evidence included in the audit report and used to demonstrate the facility's implementation of R2 requirements. Areas of concern are used to identify areas where additional R2 auditor training or knowledge-based resources are needed. Spot inspections of R2 facilities conducted by SERI or a SERI representative are assessments conducted as part of SERI's quality control program and not always in response to a complaint or concern. Any concerns resulting from the audit are communicated to the facility's CB. Witness audits are announced assessments conducted by SERI or a SERI representative in conjunction with the planned CB audit of an R2 facility. The SERI assessor evaluates the audit team's understanding of the R2 standard as well as the R2 facility's application of the R2 standard. For more detailed information on the Code of Practices, download the full version from the R2 document library on the SERI website.